Project Management for Healthcare Managers, Week 5, Project Planning, Scope Management, HCML 375. Scoping is a critical part of planning. It provides the boundaries and provides clarity on the deliverables of the project and what the project is about. And it creates the foundation for schedule, planning for budget, and being able to embed quality in your project, and being able to identify risk. During this first process group, we are looking at scoping in the planning phase. Scoping is that activity that describes the product or service and its boundaries. It is the outcome of the project. These are a couple of key questions that need to be asked because there are different audience and different stakeholders that need to be considered when looking at scope. First of all, what does the customer want? What is the output of the project according to the needs of the customer? When we talk about quality, what we're talking about is what does the customer want? The first question to ask, what does the customer want in terms of the project? It is key to determining what the scope of the customer wants and what is out of scope or what they don't care about. The big question is what the sponsor wants. What is the bigger intention? What is the sponsor as a leader trying to get out of the project? The better they can define what that is, the better they can give direction to how much money they want to spend, what the budget is going to be, what the resources are that they are willing to contribute. Part of this phase is being able to ask those questions and be intentional about what goes into the planning. Finally, what does the business want? We talked about strategy and how projects are better off aligned with strategy of the goals of the company. What does the business want out of it, and how does it align to corporate strategy? The two big questions in scope management, besides who are we trying to satisfy, is what is going to be in scope? What are the outcomes that are important to deliver? And what don't we want to focus on? These are the requirements or results that are included in the final outcome of the project to identify the processes that are going to be used and what type of resources needed, so that the in scope becomes that laundry list of what will be included or considered when planning a project. Out of scope is just as important as in scope. Out of scope are those list of requirements that will not be included in the final results. This might be important in the planning, so that not everything gets stuck into the project, and you're creating a project with a set of boundaries, and you don't have someone on the team that is expecting something to be there when it's not needed by the customer, the business, or the sponsor. So be clear about what is out of scope and will not be in the project, and in scope will be the things that are included in the project. There are certain classification of requirements. The business requirements are the things that are related to strategy. They are that are related to the nuts and bolts of the business. This is the benefit of project to business, and the requirements are the outputs that support the strategy, the tactics, and the business. The technical requirements, if this happens to be a technology-related project, typically would be like an IT project, but it could also be the use of a piece of new equipment that's not necessarily in the IT department. The technical requirements need to be identified. What is needed for the project in terms of architecture and how does it find its way into the bigger technical infrastructure of the organization. These questions need to be worked out during the planning management phase to identify technical requirements that need to be considered and included in the plan during this phase. We talked about a customer being a stakeholder and having requirements. A good plan that is promoted through PMI is one that can measure what the customer wants. And we can get these through customer value metrics, which would be included in requirements. Identify customer value metrics, being able to identify what the customer wants, and then being able to measure before it starts is really key to be able to deliver at the end for a successful project that you want. And those quality metrics, and quality are those metrics that are critical to quality, items that rise up and become those characteristics that are most important to the customer. And these would be included in the quality plan. One of the tools or one of the documents that comes out of scope management is the scope statement. The scope statement is the defined description of what's included. It may also have what's excluded and what's out of scope. It has a description of what the product or service will be, and will be descriptive as far as what the specifications that are included and the final workings of the output that's being produced. It might describe a typical customer or what would be typical common use for this product or service. And included in the scope statement would be acceptance criteria for the output, where the fit and form that needs to be required in developing and producing this project is defined. Developing acceptable criteria is key in determining the measure of success once you get to the end of the project. The deliverables are the specific requirements that gets delivered to the customer or other business or even the sponsor. And those deliverables are those tangible things that come out and are the source of measurement to the outcome of the project. Constraints that are identified in the scope statement are limiting factors. Those are guide rails to the project for things like scope constraints, resource constraints, monetary constraints, and those things really need to be identified up front in the scope statement so that all the planning downstream can take place. And any assumptions that need to be called out in the scope statement so the outcome is clear, so that there's no ambiguity embedded into the project. One of the challenges of very large projects is that the scope is sometimes hard to determine, especially during a multi-phasic project when there's another phase of the project that depends on the first project. The way that PMI approaches large project where the scope or project management may not be defined in some of the steps, progressive elaboration is being able to estimate what the scope of work is and then adding detail when more details are known. It's like peeling off the layers of the onion to be able to visualize the inner parts of the onion and to make discrete plans, more detailed plans, based on events that first happened. Once the scope statement is complete, the next document that gets created through scope management is the work breakdown structure. The work breakdown structure is used by project managers for scheduling, budgeting, risk, and quality. The work breakdown structure breaks the project down into manageable tasks. And typically the inputs from the work breakdown structure are the requirements and deliverables and anything else that is included in the scope statement. The charter should be reviewed as well because the goals of the charter also create inputs into the work breakdown structure. The work breakdown structure is built by an activity called work decomposition, being able to break up work into smaller parts. The parts are defined by the skill of the project manager who is performing the work decomposition. Work is divided into smaller units, which can be phase or by deliverable, broken down into smaller units that manage cost and duration at lower levels. You will likely have a variation depending on the size and complexity, where some projects only have a few tasks and some have a lot of tasks that need to be managed. Whenever I do work decomposition and a work breakdown structure, it would be likely different than another project manager would create. Each project, it may be unique in what is included in the requirements in the scope statement. Project managers may choose different tasks to complete the project so that the work breakdown structure may look different for projects that appear to be similar. The steps to decompose include identifying and analyzing the deliverables, then structuring and organizing the deliverables, being able to decompose the tasks in the lower levels, develop and assign identification codes to all the items, then verify whether the level is appropriate through validation. This is an example of a simple process that I'll work through and perform a work decomposition. This is the process of making pie. What I've displayed here starts at the top box, is to make the pie. The process of making the pie is broken down into 3 major steps. The first step is the assembly step, and the next step is the prepare step, and the third step is the bake step. The first step, or the assembly step, can be broken up into smaller steps. One step where all the ingredients are collected and assembled on the counter, and the second is where the kitchen tools are collected. The kitchen tools are items like a measuring cup or a rolling pin. I've broken this into 2 different tasks, and depending on the project manager, they might decompose this differently. But in this example, I'm choosing to break the assembly into 2 manageable steps. For the prepare step, I have broken this down into 3 parts, which are the filling, the crust, and putting it together to create the pie. Each of those steps are further broken down into smaller steps. The filling step has 3 steps, the crust has 3 steps, and completing the pie has 2 steps. Once the 8 sub-steps that make up the prepare step is complete, the pie is ready for baking. Baking is pretty simple. I didn't break this into smaller tasks. Basically, this is how most work breakdown structures look. A main task that is broken down into smaller manageable tasks. Depending on the project, the steps of the project may be broken into section or even tertiary levels. Assigning identification codes is best practice based on PMI methods. Assigning codes is based on the level of the task. The top level is the whole number, and then add a decimal for each level and populate the second position for the second task, then follow the pattern. Tertiary, we get 3 decimal numbers, and the lower levels displayed here we get 4 positions. In this example, making the pie is a whole number 1. The first step, the assembly, gets numbered 1.1, the prepare is 1.2, and the baking is 1.3. In the assembly step, the steps below get 1.1.1 and 1.1.2. I've incremented the third decimal place on that level. If we follow the prepare, the lowest level is broken into 4 decimal places. The first lowest level step is 1.2.1.1. The next step is 1.2.1.2. And the pattern is repeated till all the boxes have been assigned a number. This is the best practice for PMI and will help track each task. If we took the same work breakdown and created an outline instead of boxes, the outline would look like this. You can see how I've used the indentation to make it easier to differentiate the lower levels. I've added the codes to each of the tasks from the previous page to create this outline. The next step is to choose the lowest level item to plan the schedule and budget. In this case, the lowest level items are the 2 steps that make up the assembly step, the 8 sub-steps that make up the prepare step, and the baking, which there's only 1 step. These make up the lowest level steps. It's important to note here why only the lowest level steps are used. The addition of the sub-steps make up the step that is above it, and using the step above would add extra steps, which would add extra time and costs that have already been accounted for. For example, the assembly step is broken into 2 parts. If you added both the parts and also added the step above, you would count the same step twice. Only the lowest level steps is used for scheduling budgeting. One of the tools for scope management is work breakdown structure or work breakdown structure dictionary, or the WBS dictionary. The WBS dictionary holds extra information about each task that would not be relevant in a work breakdown structure but needs to be recorded. Some examples include data like responsible party or acceptable criteria. Neither would be used in calculating scheduler budget, but is important information. The code and description may be a part of the work breakdown structure and are included in the WBS dictionary as identifiers to each task. Here's an example of a work breakdown structure dictionary for making pie. I have included the main task name and the code or number, and I've also included a description what's included in the identified steps. Notice that not all the lower level steps are included, only the ones that have items that are needed for each step. It would be possible to include these in the boxes in the work breakdown structure. It just makes it easier to store in a dictionary like this. After the work breakdown structure is complete, you would review the documents to make sure everything is accounted for. Everything that is in scope would be included in the work breakdown structure, and the output from the step would make up the requirements in the deliverable. Quality control is meeting the customer's needs, and that the form and function of the project satisfy what the customer wants. To review, we talked about what's in scope and what's out of scope. In scope are the things that will be included, and out of scope will be the things that are excluded. Scope management is managing the requirements and deliverables, and the scope statement is a description of the project and its output and the acceptance criteria, and possibly constraints or assumptions of the project. We reviewed the steps of the work breakdown structure and walked through an example. Then we reviewed a work breakdown structure dictionary, including what may be on the list.